Hey, Grace House Churches. Hopefully you have enjoyed the meal and are excited about a conversation on the last half of Hebrews 12. So for a quick catch up, 10 chapters, Jesus is greater than everything. Last chapter, story of faithfulness in other generations, turns to our turn. Chapter 12, run with perseverance. And then it's almost like a lawyer closing his arguments. And the author of Hebrews gives us 4 Old Testament pictures to close down his sermon. And they are Esau, Sinai, Zion, and Abel. He starts by saying, now that you've inherited the gospel, the gift to you, don't be like Esau. Esau is a guy who exchanged his birthright for food. The author's telling us, don't exchange the gospel for anything. Don't be people who remove a permanent glory in your life for some momentary satisfaction. And so that's kind of the opening challenge. And then he compares 2 mountains. So Sinai in Exodus 19 is where God met with his people. And when Moses led the people to meet with God, they were terrified. The mountain was smoking and thunder was there and there was trumpet blasts and they couldn't approach the mountain because God was so holy. So the author of Hebrews calls back to that and he says, remember Exodus 19 at Sinai. And the people are like, of course we know that story. Well, that story was terrifying. So the principle is that unmediated holiness of God is terrifying, that we can't step into his presence lightly. But that's just a setup. That whole thing was just to turn. And then he says, but that's not the mountain we're going to. We're going to Zion, where there are angels waiting, saints of old waiting, the church is waiting, Jesus is waiting, God himself is waiting. And so kind of the crescendo of this whole thing is that because of Jesus, we don't get Sinai, we get Zion. Which begs the question, like, what happened between Sinai to Zion? What was in the middle there that gave us going from fear and trembling and sorrow to joy with the saints and the angels and singing with God himself? Well, then he answers that by saying Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant, and the sprinkled blood of Christ now speaks a better word than Abel. Throwing back to Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. Abel's blood cries out from the ground to God. And God goes to Cain and says, where's your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And the author closes down the argument by saying that story of Cain and Abel is connected to the gospel story because Abel's blood cries out for justice. Jesus' blood offers us justice. Abel's blood shows the brokenness of the world. Jesus' blood heals the brokenness. Abel's blood was a part of ushering in death. Jesus' blood secures us and heals us and defeats death completely. And then lastly, that God goes to Cain and he says, am I my brother's keeper? But God goes to Jesus and Jesus says, I am my brother's keeper. And so this is how he lays out the argument. But the question for us is, are we experiencing the gifts of the gospel? Are we treasuring them to such a degree that we would trade them for nothing? Are we walking into God's presence unhindered and unafraid? Or are we still kind of living in that Exodus 19 fear and trembling? So my hope is that we would do what the last few verses say, that we would worship with thanksgiving, we would have awe and reverence for God because he is a consuming fire, but he has offered us access to himself. And so would you be willing to have a conversation about the honest things that are keeping you from experiencing the gifts of the gospel?